June 1945 did not arrive with celebration at Camp Gruber. There were no cheers, no bands, no sense of victory drifting through the dust. The war ended the way exhaustion ends an argument, quietly, leaving everyone unsure what to do next. For most prisoners, that silence felt like release. For 16-year-old Lukas Brandt, it felt like the moment before something went wrong. He stood at the edge of the compound gripping the chain-link fence, fingers curled so tight around the wire that the metal bit into his skin. He did not notice the blood at first. Pain had become background noise. Beyond the fence, the Oklahoma prairie stretched out endlessly, grass bending under a wide sky that looked almost unreal after months behind barbed wire. Freedom sat just beyond his reach, open and unguarded, and Lukas could not make himself step toward it. A guard's boots crunched behind him. Gravel shifted. Lukas stayed still. He had learned early that sudden movements invited attention, and attention invited consequences. The war had taught him that rules mattered more than explanations. Now the war was over, and the rules were changing again. "You're going home soon," the guard said, not unkindly.
The words landed like a threat.
Lukas turned slowly. The guard was young, maybe 20, with tired eyes and a rifle that looked heavier than it needed to be. His name patch read Miller. Lukas had seen him before, always near the fence, always watching without staring.
Lukas swallowed.
His English was careful, practiced in whispers at night, shaped by fear of being misunderstood.
"Please," Lukas said. "Don, send me back." The guard stiffened.
This was not how conversations were supposed to go. Prisoners asked for cigarettes, for extra bread, for letters home. They did not ask to stay. Miller glanced toward the watchtower, then back at the boy.
"Why wouldn't you want to go home?" he asked.
Lukas searched for words that would not sound weak or ungrateful. "Because there is nothing there," he said finally. "Because here I am not hungry. Because here no one shouts my name like it is an accusation."
Miller said nothing.
He should have told the boy to step away from the fence. He should have reminded him that prisoners did not choose their destinations. Instead, he stood there, feeling something familiar tighten in his chest. He had a younger brother who had begged once too, begged not to be sent into a hedgerow in France where he never came back. "I don't make those decisions," Miller said.
"I know," Lukas said quickly.
"I just wanted someone to hear it." That night, Miller wrote a short note in his logbook.
Nothing specific.
Just a mention that morale among the younger prisoners was unstable. He did not mention the boy's hands bleeding against the fence. He told himself it was enough. Before the war took him, Lukas had been ordinary. That was the hardest part to explain later, how ordinary his life had been before it vanished. His father repaired bicycles. His mother kept a small garden behind their apartment building in Hamburg. Lukas went to school, complained about homework, dreamed about traveling without knowing what that meant. When the air raids began, ordinary disappeared quickly.
Windows shattered, streets burned, friends stopped coming to class.
By the time men in uniform arrived with clipboards and a voice that allowed no argument, Lukas had already learned that saying no did not protect you. They gave him a uniform that didn't fit and a rifle he barely knew how to hold. They told him he was defending something sacred. He did not feel sacred. He felt small and cold and afraid of disappointing people who had already lost too much. He never fired at anyone. When American soldiers captured him near the Rhine, he dropped the rifle immediately and raised his hands so fast his shoulders ached. One of them laughed, not cruelly, and handed him a piece of candy. Lukas cried later, alone, ashamed of how much that small kindness had undone him. The journey to America blurred into days of gray water and cramped silence. Some boys talked endlessly, promising escape, promising revenge, promising they would rebuild everything the moment they returned. Lukas listened and said nothing. He watched the ocean and tried not to imagine what waited on the other side. When they arrived in Oklahoma, the land shocked him. It was too open, too quiet, as if the world had decided to stop closing in on itself. Camp Gruber was not gentle, but it was not cruel either. The guards were strict, but predictable. The food was plain and plentiful. There were classrooms run by men who spoke German without hatred in their voices. There were books Lukas had never been allowed to read. Slowly, without realizing it, he began to sleep through the night. That frightened him more than hunger ever had. Dr. Weiss, one of the instructors, asked questions Lukas had never heard spoken aloud. He did not shout when the boys argued. He did not punish them for doubting. When he showed them photographs and newspaper articles, Lukas felt something inside him begin to fracture.
Not all at once, piece by piece.
Truth did not arrive like a revelation. It crept in quietly, rearranging things when Lukas wasn't looking.
Then the war ended.
The announcement crackled through loudspeakers on May 8th. Some boys cheered. Others sat in stunned silence. Lukas felt his stomach drop. Victory, he realized, did not belong to him. It belonged to governments, to generals, to people who would never stand at a fence begging not to be sent away. Rumors spread quickly.
Ships were coming.
Trains were being arranged.
The Geneva Convention demanded repatriation.
Lukas learned the word repatriation and hated it instantly.
It sounded clean, official.
Nothing like the ruins he remembered or the unanswered letters he carried folded in his pocket. He began to dread daylight. One evening, he found Miller near the fence again. "They're sending us back," Lukas said, as if saying it aloud might make it less real.
Miller nodded.
"That's what they're saying." Lukas hesitated, then asked the question he had been carrying for weeks. "If someone didn't get on the truck," he said, "what would happen?" Miller looked at him sharply.
"Don't," he said.
"That's not something you want to test."
Lukas nodded. He understood warnings.
He had lived inside them for years. Still, the idea lodged in his mind and refused to leave. When the trucks finally arrived in June, names were called in groups. Belongings were packed quickly. Guards moved with new urgency, their kindness replaced by efficiency.
Lukas stood in line, heart pounding, watching the gate inch closer.
When his name was called, something inside him resisted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet refusal of someone who has already lost everything once. At the gate, Lukas turned toward Miller. His voice shook despite his effort.
"Please," he said again. "I don't belong there anymore." Miller's jaw tightened.
He glanced at the officer overseeing the transfer, then back at Lukas.
For a moment, Lukas thought something might change.
Instead, Miller placed a hand lightly on his shoulder and guided him forward. "I'm sorry," he said. And for the first time, Lukas understood that apologies did not always come with mercy. The truck doors closed behind him. As the vehicle pulled away, Lukas looked back at the fence, at the land beyond it, and felt something inside him harden. Whatever waited for him across the ocean, he would face it. But he would never forget the moment he learned that rules could bend for some and break others completely. The truck ride from Camp Gruber felt longer than the ocean crossing that had brought Lukas to America months earlier.
The engine roared, dust rising behind the tires like a curtain closing on something unfinished.
The boys sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, bundles clutched to their chests.
No one spoke.
They had already said everything worth saying in the weeks before. Promises had been whispered, fears had been shared and then swallowed back. Now there was only movement, forward and irreversible. Lukas kept his eyes on the narrow crack at the back of the truck where sunlight leaked through. Each time the road curved, the prairie disappeared a little more. He told himself not to look back, but he did anyway. The fence was gone from sight almost immediately, yet he still felt it in his hands, the rough wire pressed into his skin as if it had left a mark deeper than blood. At the rail station, guards shouted instructions that sounded sharper than before. Efficiency had replaced patience.
Papers were checked twice.
Names were ticked off lists. Lukas noticed how easily boys were reduced to ink and numbers. When you were written down correctly, nothing else mattered.
Not fear. Not hope.
Not the way your stomach twisted when you thought of what waited on the other side of the ocean. The train ride blurred into heat and sweat and the smell of metal. Somewhere behind him, a boy began to cry softly.
No one told him to stop.
That mercy, small and unexpected, hurt more than cruelty would have. Lukas leaned his head against the wall of the car and closed his eyes, letting memory intrude because it was easier than imagining the future. Hamburg appeared exactly as he had feared it would.
Broken, gray,
hollowed out like something eaten from the inside. The port smelled of rust, smoke and damp wood.
Cranes lay tilted in the water like dead animals.
Buildings stood without windows, without roofs, without purpose. When Lukas stepped off the ship, the ground felt unsteady beneath his feet, not because it moved, but because nothing here felt real anymore.
Processing took hours.
British officers asked questions Lukas barely understood.
Forms were filled.
Instructions were given. He was handed a travel pass and told where to go next. No one asked where he wanted to be. That question had already been answered for him. The train to Hamburg rattled through countryside that looked wounded. Fields were pocked with craters. Farmhouses leaned at odd angles. Roofs collapsed like broken ribs. Lukas pressed his forehead to the cracked glass and tried to reconcile this place with the word home.
He could not.
When he reached the street where his family's apartment had once stood, he did not recognize it at first. The landmarks were gone. The bakery on the corner was a pile of blackened brick. The building itself had collapsed inward, leaving nothing but rubble and a smell that made Lukas step back. He stood there for a long time, unsure what to do next. Morning required certainty.
He had none.
A woman passing by stopped when she saw him standing there. She asked who he was looking for. Lukas said his mother's name.
The woman shook her head.
She suggested checking the refugee lists at the church. Lukas thanked her and walked away, each step heavier than the last.
The lists took hours to search. Names blurred together.
Lukas traced the columns with his finger, afraid he might miss something. He did not find his mother. He found an aunt listed as deceased. He found neighbors he remembered, some marked missing, some alive in camps he had never heard of. When he finally stepped outside, night had fallen. The city was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There were no revelations, no sudden reunions. Lukas lived in a shelter with other boys who had returned to nothing. They shared food, rumors, and resentment. Some talked endlessly about America, describing it with a bitterness that sounded almost like longing. Others refused to mention it at all, as if naming the place might reopen wounds they could not afford. Lukas took work wherever he could find it, clearing rubble, carrying bricks, scraping ash from places where houses had once stood.
His hands hardened, his body adjusted.
His mind stayed restless. At night, he dreamed of the prairie, of space so wide it made breathing easy. He woke with his heart racing, ashamed of missing a place that had rejected him in the end. He wrote letters
To aid organizations,
to offices that promised help, to addresses he barely trusted. Weeks passed without response. When answers came, they were polite and empty. Regret,
policy, circumstances beyond control.
The words formed a pattern Lukas began to recognize. No one was to blame, which meant nothing would change. There were moments when anger surged up unexpectedly. When someone complained about shortages or discipline, Lukas felt something sharp rise in his chest. He had lived in a place where rules had kept him fed and safe. Now he lived in a place where rules existed only to remind him what he no longer had. The contradiction made him reckless in small ways.
He skipped lines.
He argued with officials. Once, he was struck for speaking out of turn. He did not fight back. He learned again how easily a body could be put in its place. Years passed, marked by seasons and the slow reconstruction of streets Lukas barely remembered. He attended night classes and learned a trade. He found work repairing machinery, something steady and predictable. It helped quiet his thoughts. Still, America lingered at the edges of his mind, not as a promise, but as a question that refused to settle. In 1948, Lukas applied for a visa. He filled out the forms carefully, his handwriting neat, his answers honest. He explained his time as a prisoner. He explained his desire to return, to work, to live quietly. The rejection arrived months later, thin and impersonal. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He did not throw it away. He needed proof that he had tried. He applied again a year later.
Another rejection.
This one stung less. Pain dulled when repeated often enough.
In 1952, something shifted.
Germany was rebuilding. Alliances were changing. The same governments that had insisted on his return now spoke of cooperation and new beginnings. Lukas filled out the forms one more time. This time, he did not allow himself to hope. Hope had become dangerous. When the approval arrived, he read it twice to be sure. Then he sat down on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall until his hands stopped shaking. Leaving again did not feel like escape. It felt like finishing something that had been interrupted years earlier. The return to America was quieter than the first journey.
No guards, no list.
Just a young man with a single suitcase and an accent that marked him as foreign. He settled in a town not far from where Camp Gruber had once stood. He did not seek it out immediately. He needed distance from memory before he could face it.
Life unfolded slowly. He worked.
He learned English properly this time, not the careful classroom version shaped by fear. He met people who did not ask questions.
He married.
He became someone others depended on. From the outside, his life looked stable, even ordinary. From the inside, he carried a constant awareness of how easily it could have been otherwise. He never forgot the guard at the fence, not because of what the man had done, but because of what he had not done. The absence lingered longer than action ever could. Lukas understood eventually that betrayal did not always come dressed as cruelty. Sometimes it wore the face of regret and apologies and rules that claimed to protect everyone equally. As the years went on, Lukas began to wonder about the boys who had not boarded the trucks. The ones who had vanished into the margins of history. He did not know their names, but he felt their presence like shadows just out of sight.
The thought unsettled him.
It suggested that survival was not always a matter of worth, but of timing, of instinct, of a guard looking the other way. That idea followed him into middle age, into quiet evenings and ordinary conversations. It shaped the way he raised his children, teaching them to question systems that claimed fairness while practicing convenience. It shaped the way he listened when others spoke of rules and duty, hearing beneath the words the quiet cost they rarely acknowledged. Lukas never fully decided whether begging had been a mistake, but he understood this much. The moment at the fence had defined him more than any uniform ever could. It had taught him that dignity could exist even in refusal, even when refusal failed. And somewhere, unspoken but persistent, lived the knowledge that someone else had chosen differently, and been allowed to disappear. That knowledge waited patiently, ready to surface when the time was right. Lukas did not begin looking for answers right away. For a long time, it felt safer to believe that what happened at Camp Gruber had been inevitable, that every boy had boarded the trucks, that no cracks had existed in the system that sent him back across the ocean. Believing that made his own obedience easier to accept. It allowed him to tell himself that survival had nothing to do with courage or timing, only luck. And luck, he had learned, was not something you could resent without destroying yourself. The first doubt crept in quietly, almost accidentally. It happened one afternoon when Lukas was in his 40s, repairing a piece of machinery at a small factory outside Tulsa. A man he worked with mentioned the war in passing, something about his uncle who had lived near an old POW camp. The man spoke casually, without drama, as if repeating a story he had heard many times growing up. They had German boys out there, the man said. Kids, really. One of them just vanished. Folks said a family hid him. Nobody talked about it much. Lukas felt his hands go numb. He kept his head down, tightening a bolt that didn't need tightening, afraid that if he looked up his face would betray him. Vanished how? He asked, forcing his voice to stay even.
The man shrugged. Just gone. Before they shipped them back. War was messy. Things slipped.
That night, Lukas could not sleep. The sentence looped endlessly in his mind.
Things slipped.
He had stood at the fence believing there were no gaps, no spaces wide enough to crawl through. Yet somewhere, someone had slipped through anyway. The idea felt like a bruise he hadn't known he carried, suddenly pressed hard enough to ache. He did not tell Mary at first. He did not know how to explain what he was feeling without sounding bitter or ungrateful. America had given him a life. That fact was undeniable. But gratitude, he realized, did not erase questions. It simply made them harder to ask. Weeks later, an envelope arrived with no return address. His name was written carefully on the front, the letters deliberate, almost cautious. Lukas stood in the doorway holding it, feeling a familiar tightening in his chest. Mary asked what it was. Lukas said he wasn't sure and slipped it into his pocket, already certain that whatever waited inside would not be harmless. He opened it alone at the kitchen table late that night. The letter was short and written in German. The handwriting was neat, restrained.
I saw you once at the fence. You begged. I did not. I ran.
If you remember Otto, you should know I lived. Lukas stared at the words until the room seemed to tilt slightly.
Otto.
The name pulled him backward instantly, to the ship crossing, to a loud boy from Munich who laughed too much and promised escape with the confidence of someone who had never tested consequence. Otto had spoken of stealing a boat, of disappearing into America and rebuilding everything by force of will. Lukas had assumed Otto was dead, crushed by ruins or hunger or punishment. He had mourned him quietly, without knowing he was doing it. The letter continued.
A family hid me. A guard looked away. I changed my name. I stayed quiet. I watched others leave. I never forgot your face at the wire.
There was no signature,
no address,
nothing that could be followed. Lukas folded the paper carefully, as if it might tear if handled too roughly. His hands shook, not with anger, but with something colder and more precise. For years, he had told himself that begging had been his only option, that honesty had been his dignity. Now he understood something else had been true at the same time. Silence had protected Otto. Disappearance had been rewarded. The system that punished compliance had quietly allowed defiance to succeed. The betrayal settled slowly, like sediment sinking to the bottom of clear water. It was not only that Otto had lived. It was that Otto had lived because someone had chosen him. Someone had risked something for him. Someone had decided that rules could bend just once, for a boy who ran instead of asking. Lukas began searching quietly.
Public libraries, old newspapers, county records. He did not rush.
He had learned that patience revealed more than force ever could. He found small mentions of Camp Gruber in local papers.
Charity drives, church visits, community picnics.
And then, buried in a brief article from the summer of 1945, a single line. German youth missing during transfer. Believed to have fled custody. Investigation ongoing.
No name, no description, just the absence.
Another article appeared weeks later. Investigation concluded. No charges filed. Lukas sat back in his chair, feeling something harden inside him. No charges filed meant someone had been questioned.
Someone had known.
Someone had been protected.
Only one face came to mind. Thomas Miller.
The guard had been young, conflicted, careful with his words. He had said he didn't make decisions. He had said he was sorry. Lukas had believed him. He realized now that belief had been another kind of surrender. Finding Miller took time.
People moved. Names changed.
Lives drifted apart. Lukas asked questions carefully, framing them as curiosity rather than accusation. Eventually, a name surfaced.
An address.
A quiet house in a modest neighborhood, a faded flag hanging near the door. Lukas sat in his car across the street for nearly an hour before getting out. He told himself he wasn't angry. He told himself he only wanted the truth. But truth, he knew, rarely came without cost. Miller answered the door himself. He was older now, heavier, lines carved deep into his face. For a moment, he didn't recognize Lukas. Then something shifted behind his eyes. You, Miller said quietly. Lukas held up the letter without greeting. Did you know? Miller looked at the paper as if it were a weapon. He stepped back, allowing Lukas inside. The house smelled of coffee and old wood. They sat at the kitchen table, the same distance between them as years earlier, separated by things neither had said. "I knew someone disappeared," Miller said after a long pause. "That's not what I asked," Lukas replied. His voice was calm, almost detached, and that frightened him more than anger would have. Miller rubbed his hands together slowly. "A boy ran during a stop," he said. "A family nearby, church people. They offered food sometimes. He ran toward their land. I didn't chase." "You let him go," Lukas said. Miller nodded once. "Yes." The word landed heavily between them. "Why him?" Lukas asked. "Why not me?" Miller's shoulders slumped. He stared at the table, at the grain of the wood, at anything except Lukas's face. "Because you asked," he said finally. "Because you stayed where you were supposed to." Running was chaos. Chaos I could ignore. Begging created records. Records created responsibility. Lukas felt something inside him break, not violently, but cleanly, like a bone snapping under pressure it had endured for too long. He had believed honesty mattered. He had believed dignity mattered. He understood now that those things were liabilities in systems built on control. "You broke the rules," Lukas said. "Just not for me." Miller's voice cracked. "I tried to help you the right way." "The right way," Lukas repeated softly. Miller looked up, eyes wet. "I thought obedience would protect you." Lukas stood. The coffee between them sat untouched. He realized he had not come for an apology. Apologies were easy. He had come to understand the shape of the betrayal, to see it clearly enough that it could no longer haunt him from the edges of memory. At the door, Lukas turned back. "Did Otto live?" he asked. Miller nodded. "As far as I know. Changed his name, worked a farm, married, stayed quiet." Lukas felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Otto had survived by becoming invisible. Lukas had survived by becoming acceptable. Neither path felt heroic. Both had cost something essential. When Lukas stepped back outside, the air felt sharp and real. The world had not changed, but his understanding of it had. He had not been spared because he was worthy. He had been sacrificed because he was compliant. Driving home, Lukas did not feel rage. He felt clarity. Systems, he understood, did not reward morality. They rewarded usefulness, silence, and luck. Kindness existed within them, but only in fragments, only when individuals chose to risk something. That night, Lukas took out an old letter he had written years earlier, an unsent apology to no one in particular. He tore it into small pieces and dropped them into the trash. He no longer felt the need to explain himself to the past. Instead, he began to write something new. A record, not for justice, not for revenge, but for truth. Because the hardest betrayal was not being sent back. It was learning that staying had always been possible, just not for everyone, and that knowledge would not let him rest quietly ever again. Lukas did not sleep the night after meeting Miller. He lay in bed listening to the slow rhythm of Mary's breathing, staring at the ceiling as if answers might appear there if he watched long enough. The betrayal did not burn the way he had expected. It settled instead, heavy and deliberate, reshaping old memories with new meaning. Every moment at Camp Gruber replayed differently now. The fence, the warning, the apology, all of it rearranged itself into a pattern he could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed, Lukas moved through his days with a careful calm that unsettled even him. He went to work. He laughed at the right moments. He paid attention when his children spoke. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. He no longer believed that the past was finished with him. He no longer believed that understanding came with closure. The letter from Otto stayed folded in his wallet, tucked behind a photograph Lukas carried everywhere without realizing why. He did not reread the letter often. He did not need to. Its weight was constant. Otto had run. Otto had been chosen. Otto had been spared not because he was more deserving, but because the moment had bent in his favor. Lukas began to wonder how many other moments like that had existed in his life, unseen and unclaimed. Mary noticed the change before he mentioned it. One evening, as they washed dishes together, she said quietly, "You're carrying something heavier than usual." Lukas dried his hands and leaned against the counter. For years, he had protected her from the darker edges of his history, offering fragments instead of the whole. Now the fragments no longer held. He told her everything. He spoke of the fence and the begging, of the truck and the return, of the letter and the man who had been allowed to disappear. He did not dramatize it. He did not raise his voice. That restraint made the story harder to hear. Mary listened without interrupting, her hands still in the water long after the dishes were clean. "So you did everything right," she said finally. "And that's why you were punished." Lukas did not argue. He understood now that punishment was not always intentional. Sometimes it was simply the byproduct of systems designed to move efficiently, not humanely. "What do you want to do?" Mary asked. The question surprised him. Wanting had always felt dangerous, something the war had trained out of him.
I don't know, he said honestly.
But I don't want this to stay hidden. That was the moment the story began to move toward its true climax. Not with shouting or violence, but with a decision that felt small and irreversible. Lukas began to write.
At first, the words came slowly.
He wrote at night, after the house had gone quiet, sitting at the kitchen table under a single light. He did not frame the story as accusation. He framed it as testimony. He wrote about boys whose names history did not remember. About rules that claimed neutrality while choosing sides quietly. About how mercy often arrived disguised as neglect. He wrote about Otto, though he never used the name. He wrote about the guard, though he never identified him. He wrote about himself last, and that was the hardest part. Writing required honesty without the shelter of obedience. It forced Lukas to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had trusted rules because they promised order in a world that had already taken everything else from him. The closer he came to finishing, the more afraid he became. Publishing the story would not bring justice. It would not undo the past. It would not even guarantee that anyone cared. What it would do was expose something he had survived by keeping buried. It would strip away the last layer of safety he had built around himself. That fear sharpened when a second letter arrived. This one was addressed to his full name. I heard you spoke to Miller.
Be careful.
Some things were forgiven because they stayed quiet. There was no signature.
The message was clear.
Silence had been the condition of mercy once before, and it could be demanded again. Lukas stared at the words for a long time, feeling a familiar chill spread through his chest. The war was long over, yet the mechanisms that thrived on obedience still functioned quietly, efficiently, without uniforms. Mary read the letter and looked at him steadily.
This is the moment, she said. This is the fence again. She was right.
The choice was the same, just dressed differently. Lukas could step back, fold the letters away, and live the rest of his life in careful gratitude. Or he could speak, knowing the outcome might not favor him. The climax arrived not in public, but in private resolve. Lukas sent the manuscript to a small historical journal that specialized in overlooked wartime accounts. He did not attach demands or expectations. He simply sent the story and waited. Weeks passed without response.
Then months.
Lukas felt the familiar urge to retreat, to tell himself that trying had been enough. But something inside him resisted that narrative now. He had learned that quiet compliance did not always equal survival. Sometimes it only delayed loss. The reply arrived on a rainy afternoon. They wanted to publish it. The editor's note was careful, respectful, and cautious. Some names would need to be withheld. Some details softened. Legal concerns. Institutional sensitivities.
The usual compromises. Lukas read the note twice, then once more.
He understood the terms. He also understood what they were asking him to do. Allow the story to exist without fully naming its villains. For a moment, old habits pulled at him. Accept the conditions. Be grateful. Don't ask for more. Then he remembered the fence. Lukas wrote back politely and declined the edits. He did not argue.
He did not threaten.
He simply stated that the story required its moral clarity intact, even if that clarity was uncomfortable. He thanked them for their time and sent the message. Mary read the response over his shoulder. You know this might mean it never gets published, she said.
I know, Lukas replied.
For the first time, the knowledge did not frighten him. The resolution did not come in the form Lukas had once imagined.
There was no public reckoning.
No apology from institutions. No rewriting of history books. The journal eventually published the story in a reduced form elsewhere, without his name, without the parts that most disturbed the narrative of clean endings. Lukas did not fight it. He had already crossed the line that mattered most. What changed instead was quieter and more personal. Lukas began speaking to his children differently. Not with bitterness, but with honesty. He taught them that rules were tools, not truths. That obedience was not the same as virtue. That survival often depended on moments when people chose to act outside the lines. Years later, when Lukas returned to the prairie one last time, he stood where the fence had once been and felt no anger. He felt something closer to recognition. The boy who had begged there had not been wrong. He had simply been early. The man who stood there now understood what the boy could not yet know, that dignity sometimes required refusal even when refusal failed. The betrayal had shaped him, but it had not defined him, and in that understanding, Lukas felt the weight finally begin to lift. Lukas never learned who sent the warning letter. He considered that for a long time, turning over possibilities the way one turns a stone again and again, hoping the underside might eventually explain the shape of it.
A former officer. A church member.
Someone who had benefited from silence and wanted it preserved. In the end, he accepted that knowing the sender mattered less than understanding the message. Silence had always been the currency of survival. Speaking was what unsettled people. The story appeared quietly, not where Lukas had first sent it, and not in the form he had imagined during those long nights at the kitchen table, but it appeared all the same.
Anonymously.
Without photographs. Without commentary. Just words describing a group of boys history had not known what to do with, and one boy who had begged not to be sent back while another had been allowed to vanish. The piece did not go viral. It did not spark outrage. It circulated slowly, deliberately, among people who read such things carefully. That was enough. Letters arrived over the following year, forwarded through the journal, handwritten and hesitant. A woman whose father had guarded a camp and never spoke of it. A man who had been a child in post-war Germany and recognized the emptiness Lukas described. One letter came from a family in rural Oklahoma who admitted, without names, that they had once hidden a boy and lived the rest of their lives wondering whether it had been courage or selfishness that guided them. Lukas read every letter. He answered some. Others he folded carefully and placed in a box with the photograph and the original letter from Otto. He began to understand that truth did not demand a single ending. It spread unevenly, quietly, reshaping people in ways that were rarely visible from the outside. Otto never wrote again. Lukas sometimes imagined him somewhere nearby, living under a name that fit better, carrying his own version of the past like a scar hidden under clothing. Lukas did not resent him anymore. That feeling had burned itself out. What remained was something closer to acceptance. Otto had run because he could. Lukas had stayed because he believed in order. Neither choice was clean. Neither deserved punishment or praise. They were simply responses to fear. As Lukas grew older, memory softened around the edges. The fence no longer appeared sharp in his dreams. It became symbolic instead of painful. A line between two understandings of the world.
On one side, rules promised safety.
On the other, risk offered possibility. He had crossed that line late in life, not with his body, but with his voice. That crossing mattered more than he once believed. When his children asked him about the war as adults, Lukas did not shield them anymore. He told them the truth without bitterness. He told them that systems often rewarded the appearance of strength over honesty. That kindness survived not because it was protected, but because people chose it despite the risk. He told them that moral clarity rarely arrived when it was most needed. Near the end of his life, Lukas returned once more to the open land where Camp Gruber had stood. The prairie was unchanged, indifferent to memory.
Grass bent in the wind. The sky stretched wide and empty.
He stood there alone, feeling neither regret nor triumph, only a quiet recognition of how far he had come from the boy who once believed survival depended on obedience. He took the photograph from his wallet and studied it one last time. The image showed nothing remarkable.
Just space, just light.
Just the suggestion of freedom without instructions. He thought of Miller, of Otto, of the family who hid a boy and the boy who had not known how to run. He thought of all the moments history never recorded because they were too small, too uncomfortable, too human. When Lukas died, his service was simple. No speeches about heroism. No mention of war medals or sacrifice. Just stories told softly by people who knew him as a patient man with careful words and an unsettling honesty. Afterward, his daughter sat alone sorting through his belongings and found the box of letters, the photograph, and the final note he had written but never sent. It read, "I was not brave when it mattered most.
I was honest."
That was not enough then, but it became enough later. She folded the note and placed it back in the box. History would never list Lukas Brandt as a hero.
It would not list Otto either.
Their lives did not fit clean narratives of victory or defeat. They were shaped by chance, by fear, by moments when people chose to act or not act, knowing the consequences would ripple outward in ways they could not control. What Lukas had learned, and what he left behind quietly for others to find, was this: war does not only destroy cities and bodies, it tests how much truth a system can tolerate. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is speak honestly about what they survived. Because freedom is not always the absence of fences. Sometimes it is the refusal to pretend they were never there.